The standard map of human history often attributes global migration and maritime navigation to a single species, modern Homo sapiens. We tend to view the ability to cross oceans and settle distant islands as a skill we alone possessed. But the physical record suggests our predecessors were navigating these same environments long before us. In Apodema Cave on the southern coast of Greece, researchers found two distinct skull fragments. One was a modern human from 210,000 years ago. The other was a Neanderthal fragment from 170,000 years ago. Both species sought shelter in the same limestone cliffs, separated only by time. Further east, on the island of Luzon in the Philippines, the evidence is even older. Archaeologists discovered a butchered rhinoceros skeleton surrounded by stone tools, proving that an archaic human species was active on the island 709,000 years ago. Similar traces appear on the island of Crete, where 130,000-year-old stone tools were found scattered across the landscape. These tools are specifically identified as achulean, heavy, teardrop-shaped hand axes and cleavers. This specific toolkit belongs to the million-year-old tradition of our ancestors, like Homo erectus. By the time modern humans reached this region, they were using more refined, specialized tools, making these heavy axes a signature of an archaic presence. The geography of these sites presents a problem. Both Crete and Luzon have been isolated by deep ocean trenches for millions of years. Unlike many other islands, they were never connected to the mainland, even when sea levels were at their lowest. This creates a historical paradox. It suggests that archaic hominins were successfully crossing deep water barriers hundreds of thousands of years before the invention of the complex boats we once thought were required. The mechanism behind these ancient movements was the Earth's climate. During the Pleistocene glaciations, the planet entered a 100,000-year cycle, oscillating between periods of deep freezing and relative warmth. During cold cycles, water was locked into continental ice caps, dropping global sea levels by 125 meters, taller than the Statue of Liberty. This transformed shallow seas into walkable plains, like the sprawling Sunderland Shelf, linking mainland Asia to Java, Borneo, and Sumatra. The Beringian land bridge was equally massive, a 1,000-kilometer-wide tundra plain connecting Siberia to Alaska, covering an area the size of Florida and Georgia combined. This shifting geography allowed species like Homo erectus to simply walk out of Africa and across the Near East. They followed migrating animals across exposed savannas, reaching Indonesia by land roughly 1.8 million years ago. But these land bridges were temporary. When the ice melted, the oceans rose, flooding the lowlands and turning those vast plains back into separate islands. Populations of Homo erectus found themselves stranded on these new islands, cut off from the mainland for tens of thousands of years at a time. This cycle of isolation and reconnection acted as a driver for evolution. The constant pressure to adapt to these shifting boundaries shaped the survival strategies of human ancestors for hundreds of thousands of years. Even at the height of the ice ages, certain deep water barriers remained. The Wallace Line, an ocean trench in Indonesia, stayed impassable on foot even when sea levels were at their lowest. This leads to two theories. Either archaic humans were swept across these trenches accidentally on rafts of storm-tossed vegetation, or they were intentionally building primitive watercraft. Navigation in these chains didn't require sailing into the unknown. Because many of these islands are mountainous, their peaks remain visible even from a distance, allowing for line-of-sight navigation where the destination is always in view. In Oceania, volcanic peaks rise up to 3,700 meters. From one island shore, the height of the next ensures a clear target on the horizon. By 70,000 years ago, modern Homo sapiens began a new sustained expansion. Once again, they were aided by the climate. Around 50,000 years ago, monsoonal rains turned parts of the Arabian desert into green corridors filled with freshwater lakes. These temporary, hospitable environments allowed our ancestors to move quickly through regions that would be impassable today. They eventually reached Sahul, the landmass of Australia and New Guinea, which required crossing substantial stretches of open water. Indigenous Australian genetics show no signs of a severe bottleneck, which would occur if only a few survivors reached the continent. Instead, high genetic diversity suggests the colonization of Sahul was the result of a large, intentional migration involving hundreds or even thousands of people. The end of the last ice age brought a violent transition. As the glaciers melted, millions of gallons of meltwater rapidly raised sea levels. 8,200 years ago, a massive underwater landslide known as the Storge Slide occurred off the coast of Norway. The resulting tsunami flooded the remaining lowlands of Doggerland in a single generation. This event permanently severed the land connection to the continent, turning Britain into an island. For the people living along these coasts, the experience of watching entire landscapes vanish beneath the waves was a transformative trauma. These events correlate with the enduring presence of flood stories in oral traditions across the globe, such as the myth of the sinking of Atlantis. Generations of hunting grounds and coastal settlements were lost to the tide, leaving the maps of the ancient world buried under the sea. Between 5,000 and 3,000 years ago, the Austronesian and Polynesian peoples developed a new approach to the sea. They moved beyond line-of-sight navigation, using the stars, bird flight paths, and swell patterns to cross thousands of miles of open water. By 1200 CE, they had reached the coast of South America. They returned to the Pacific with the sweet potato, a calorie-dense crop that had been cultivated by Native Americans for 5,000 years. This exchange represents a meeting between two sophisticated technologies, high seas navigation and advanced agricultural engineering. The map of the Earth we recognize today is only a temporary snapshot. As our coastlines continue to shift, it reminds us that much of our history is currently hidden beneath the waves, waiting to be recovered. For decades, the story of human origins was remarkably clean. Textbooks mapped a single, linear event, Homo sapiens stepping out of Africa exactly 60,000 years ago to populate an empty world. But the ground hasn't cooperated with that model. In recent years, the Earth has surrendered physical evidence that makes this tidy timeline difficult to maintain. The most striking contradiction was found in southern Greece, inside the Apodema cave. Researchers uncovered a skull thousands of miles from where any modern human was supposed to be. A partial cranium found in the cave possesses the unmistakable anatomical signatures of our species. Specifically, it features the distinctively rounded back that separates Homo sapiens from our closest relatives. The rock layer encasing this skull dates back 210,000 years. That places modern humans in Europe a full 140,000 years before the classic migration model allows. The Apodema skull establishes that modern humans reached the Mediterranean basin far earlier than the standard model predicts. This discovery suggests the map of our origins is a series of disconnected, ancient pulses. When our early Homo sapiens ancestors finally crossed into Eurasia, they stepped onto continents that were already occupied. Almost 2 million years ago, early members of the genus Homo, like Homo erectus, arrived in places like modern-day Georgia. They were the world's original globetrotters. These distant cousins carried highly developed technology. The Acheulean hand axe was a carefully planned, teardrop-shaped tool that required precise striking on both sides to achieve its symmetry. They also left traces of abstract thought. On the island of Java, researchers found a 500,000-year-old freshwater shell deliberately engraved with a geometric zigzag pattern. Homo sapiens followed paths cut by intelligent, tool-making relatives who had been mastering the environment for millions of years. The primary corridor connecting Africa to Eurasia is the Levant, a narrow strip of the Middle East that served as a biological crossroads for migrating species. Inside Maslia Cave in Israel, archaeologists uncovered an anatomically modern human jawbone dating back nearly 200,000 years. Alongside it, they found blades crafted using the Levallois technique. This method requires a hunter to mentally picture the final blade, carefully preparing the core stone before striking off the precise, sharp flake. Further evidence of complex behavior appears in the nearby Khafsek cave, dating to 100,000 years ago. Skeletons were found intentionally placed in the earth, sometimes holding deer antlers or marine shells, evidence of ritual burial and early belief systems. The Levant was also a site of close physical contact. The skeleton of a child found at School Cave displays a modern inner ear paired with a heavy, robust jawbone. It is biological proof of direct interbreeding between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. The Middle East functioned as a vibrant melting pot. For tens of thousands of years, different human lineages shared caves, exchanged tool designs, and mixed their genetics. Periodic climate cycles provided the physical openings for these early movements. Shifts in the planet's orbit caused massive rainfall, transforming barren deserts into lush corridors of grasslands and rivers. Around 85,000 years ago, what is now the Saudi Arabian desert was a network of lakes. Researchers there found a modern human finger bone lying right next to the fossils of hippopotamuses. Following these green pathways eastward, human populations reached deep into Asia. In southern China, archaeologists uncovered fully modern human teeth sealed beneath a rock layer older than 80,000 years, with some dates pushing 120,000 years. But these planetary cycles eventually turned. When global temperatures dropped and ice sheets grew, the rain stopped. The lush corridors turned back into impassable seas of sand. The pioneering populations trapped outside of Africa found themselves isolated. Unable to retreat or adapt to the rapidly cooling world, these groups eventually died out, leaving no direct living descendants today. The migration that finally populated the rest of the globe occurred around 60,000 years ago. All non-African people today trace their ancestry to this specific wave. This group carried Upper Paleolithic technology. They crafted tools from bone and antler and developed ranged weapons like spear throwers, giving them a survival advantage in harsh environments and against formidable prey. However, the earlier pioneers hadn't vanished entirely. Before dying out, they interbred with Neanderthals, passing on a fragment of DNA. When the successful 60,000-year wave later encountered these Neanderthals, they interbred again. The genetic echoes of those lost pioneers absorbed back into our main lineage. We are the product of a tangled, overlapping history. The genes of hundreds of thousands of years of exploration, interaction, and dead ends are still carried within us today. $50,000 years ago, Europe was a brutal, frozen landscape. The standard assumption for decades was that the early humans who navigated this ice age were frail, primitive scavengers, barely clinging to survival. Then came a massive discovery in March 1868. At the Cro-Magnon rock shelter in southwestern France, geologist Louis Lartet uncovered a group of 5 skeletons that completely overturned those archaic assumptions. These were anatomically modern humans, but their physical build was entirely unexpected. They were towering, highly muscular individuals, with some males in Eastern Europe standing up to 6 foot 3 inches tall. Their cognitive hardware was equally formidable. They possessed a skull with a 1,600 cubic centimeter brain capacity, which is actually slightly larger than the modern human average today. Arriving in Europe from Western Asia, they stepped into an incredibly hostile environment, sharing the continent with entrenched Neanderthal populations and apex predators like cave hyenas and bears. Their imposing physical size and deep cognitive capacity formed a baseline. They used these traits to build a highly structured society that laid the direct groundwork for modern humanity. Their bones were massive and dense. A single collarbone could measure 7.5 inches across, providing immense mechanical leverage for the shoulder to throw heavy tools and weapons with extreme velocity. That brute strength was tested constantly, yet the fossil record shows they had an incredible capacity to survive catastrophic physical trauma, tens of thousands of years before the advent of medical technology. A prime example is the first female skeleton identified at the Cro-Magnon site, featuring a massive, deep skull fracture that healed over time. Surviving this debilitating injury means she lived for years afterward. This requires deliberate communal care, being protected and fed while incapacitated. Their true evolutionary advantage was their collective willingness to protect and heal their wounded. This organized social structure extended to their domestic lives. Rather than constantly wandering, they established stable, meticulously zoned camps inside deep caverns, with designated sleeping and butchering areas. In open-air environments, they engineered large, heavily insulated huts. Their primary building materials were the giant skulls, bones, and thick pelts of woolly mammoths. To secure those heavy materials, they organized sophisticated mass game drives, efficiently cornering vast herds of heavy megafauna against cliff walls or into bodies of water for mass killings. They even began shaping other predators. Fossil evidence from Belgium and Germany reveals domesticated dogs deliberately buried alongside human companions. Constructing complex shelters and domesticating apex predators marks a profound cognitive shift. They were actively mastering their environment. As domestic lives stabilized, they built a macro society. They established continent-wide trade networks spanning over 120 miles for raw materials. These networks carried resources for survival, but also functioned as conduits for complex cultural and symbolic ideas. This cultural exchange fueled a rich artistic expression. They carved intricate Venus figurines, stone statuettes with exaggerated physical features, interpreted as central objects in fertility ceremonies. They also mastered two-dimensional art. In places like Chauvet Cave, they produced breathtaking, accurately shaded depictions of the native fauna they hunted. Their abstract thought extended into complex music. They crafted flutes, whistles, and drums from animal remains, confirming a deeply advanced intellectual life. Yet this high culture existed alongside extreme brutality. At Gough's Cave in England, archaeologists recovered human bodies meticulously butchered for marrow, and skull caps deliberately modified into drinking cups. This sharp duality, the capacity to carve a delicate bone flute and to cannibalize a rival, makes them deeply, complexly human. This harsh reality extended to their neighbors. For roughly 10,000 years, they shared the European continent with Neanderthals, fiercely competing for the same vital resources. In violent encounters, early modern humans held a distinct tactical advantage. They utilized ranged projectile weapons, like stone-tipped spear throwers, against Neanderthals' heavy, close-quarters thrusting spears. This coexistence eventually transitioned into intimate physical connection. The 40,000-year-old Oasi-1 fossil found in Romania provided the ultimate proof, challenging the pure replacement theory. This chart illustrates the genetic lineage of that specific specimen. Oasi-1 contained a staggering 9% Neanderthal DNA, placing a direct Neanderthal ancestor just 4 to 6 generations back in its family tree. The boundary between distinct human groups was highly porous. Intimate interbreeding defined large parts of early human history. Eventually, the Neanderthals vanished from the fossil record. The Cro-Magnons did not. This chart shows population estimates during the brutal last glacial maximum. While other hominid lines dropped to zero, anatomically modern human populations successfully navigated the deep freeze, multiplying to an estimated 70,000 individuals across the continent. As new agricultural populations arrived from the Near East during the Neolithic period, the established hunter-gatherers were absorbed and integrated into these incoming groups. Their deep genetic legacy was never erased. The DNA of these Ice Age survivors is actively carried by modern European populations right now. The resilience, fierce innovation, and adaptability of the Cro-Magnons remains a living blueprint, still woven into our DNA today. 10,000 years ago, slow shifts in Earth's orbit intensified the African monsoon, pushing heavy rains far to the north. Over several thousand years, the arid Sahara transformed into sweeping expanses of wetlands, massive freshwater lakes, and vibrant savanna. The people who lived there etched their daily reality directly into the rock faces. Across what is now hyper-arid desert, we find vivid depictions of hippos, rhinos, and giraffes, animals that require massive amounts of vegetation and water, species that today only survive thousands of miles to the south. Because this environment was hospitable for roughly 9 millennia, researchers long assumed it functioned as an open corridor. Intuitively, a lush central landmass connecting Europe, the Near East, and sub-Saharan Africa should have operated as a crossroads, with migrating populations constantly meeting and mixing their DNA. The evidence to test that assumption finally emerged from a natural rock shelter called Takakaro Kori, located deep within the severe, sun-baked isolation of southwestern Libya's Akakis Mountains. The remains unearthed inside Takakaro Quarry lacked the heavy genetic blending researchers expected. Instead of a melting pot of ancient travelers, scientists identified a distinct, isolated ghost lineage, revealing that the Green Sahara was a sanctuary for a population that largely stayed in place. Within the shelter, archaeologists discovered the remains of 15 people, including 2 women buried around 7,000 years ago. The extreme dryness of the Libyan desert had acted as a natural desiccant, halting the decay process and naturally mummifying their bodies, leaving skin, tissues, and even ligaments partially intact. Extracting DNA from such an environment is difficult, as heat typically shreds genetic material. However, by targeting the exceptionally dense petrous bone near the inner ear, geneticists were able to sequence their entire, complete genomes, the first time this level of detail was retrieved from such a challenging climate. Observational. This chart illustrates the contrast between these women and surrounding populations. While genomes from the Near East, Europe, and Sub-Saharan Africa show multicolored variants from constant mixing, the Takarakuri DNA is an entirely distinct, solid genetic profile, with 0 significant input from outside groups. Extending MAT data backward, the timeline traces this specific lineage splitting off from the rest of humanity roughly 50,000 years ago. While other groups migrated outward and populated the globe, the ancestors of these Takarakuri women remained separate, preserving an unmixed biological line for tens of thousands of years. A population thriving in a resource-rich environment usually experiences heavy genetic exchange with outsiders. Finding an unbroken biological island persisting right in the middle of a habitable savanna challenges our model of how ancient populations behaved in these zones. While their genetics remained static, their daily lives did not. The artifacts surrounding the Takarakuri remains prove these people were highly adaptable, adopting new lifestyles and tools as their environments slowly evolved over thousands of years. Scattered among the ancient fishing harpoons, researchers found markers of a major lifestyle shift. The rock art left by this exact population vividly illustrates them managing and herding domesticated animals. This was a shift from hunting and gathering to a managed food supply, a practice that began in the Near East long before those animals appeared in North Africa. If these herding techniques originated in the Levant and eventually reached this isolated pocket of the Sahara, we should see the genetic footprint of Near Eastern farmers who brought the animals with them. Yet, the DNA of the Takarakuri women shows no trace of Near Eastern ancestry. We generally assume that in ancient history, physical migrations drove progress. The assumption is that to get new tools, a new population had to move in and settle down. The Takarakuri site proves this is not always the case. The evidence points to a different mechanism. The technology of herding reached this isolated Saharan group through the transmission of ideas, passing from person to person without a corresponding influx of foreign genes. Rather than an invading wave of Near Eastern farmers taking over the landscape, the technology moved through localized networks. It spread via small-scale interactions and regional trade, with communities learning from their neighbors over long stretches of time. The artifacts confirm this localized approach. The pottery and tools found at Takarakuri, used to manage these domesticated herds, were distinctly North African in their style. They took the external concept of pastoralism and manufactured their own local equipment to execute it. This map visualization illustrates the concept of cultural contagion. The wave representing the behavioral idea of animal herding sweeps across the North African continent, while the distinct genetic markers of the local populations sitting directly beneath that wave remain unmixed. Humans could share complex agricultural concepts through networking alone. A society could adopt the most advanced technologies of their era while maintaining their distinct biological identity from outsiders. Roughly 5,000 years ago, those same planetary mechanics shifted once again. Earth's tilt varied, the African monsoon failed, and the lakes rapidly evaporated. The Sahara reverted into a desert, finally forcing this population to abandon their long-held sanctuary. They dispersed primarily to the north and the west. Today, their specific genetic markers, particularly paternal lineages originating over 14,000 years ago, form the foundational DNA of modern North African and Berber-speaking populations. But fragments of this DNA traveled much further. Trace amounts of that exact ancient North African paternal marker are concentrated along the Atlantic coast of Europe today, even appearing in roughly 1% of modern Scottish men. The corresponding maternal marker from this ancient North African population tells a similar story. Geneticists have identified it buried within Neolithic remains excavated in Spain, northern Portugal, and coastal Ireland. We find a cross-section of this journey preserved on the Canary Islands. Before European contact, the indigenous Guanche people carried both the maternal and paternal Saharan markers, preserving the oldest known Berber DNA in the Atlantic. Plotting these markers on a map outlines a distinct coastal path. It suggests the existence of ancient maritime trade routes, connecting the shores of North Africa to Iberia and the fringes of the British Isles long before recorded history. The collapse that dried out the Green Sahara did not erase its people. Their biological descendants navigated the oceans, weaving their genetic echoes into the early populations of Western Europe. Physical excavations support the DNA. Archaeologists in Ireland unearthed the skull of a Barbary macaque, an ape native to North Africa, dating back to 400 BCE. A live ape does not cross thousands of miles of ocean accidentally. It requires deliberate human transport. These ancient interactions also left shadows in human language. Linguists have documented deep structural parallels between early Celtic languages and North African Berber dialects, and even stranger overlaps linking the Basque language of the Pyrenees to ancient Sumerian. This is the Great Ziggurat of Ur in modern-day Iraq. Sumerian, the language once spoken here, shares rare grammatical structures with Basque, spoken thousands of miles away in Europe. These connections suggest a shared ancestral language spoken by the first farmers who expanded out from the Near East. Just as the Takarakori group remained separate in the desert, the Basque and Sumerians likely acted as linguistic islands, preserving ancient speech patterns that were elsewhere replaced by later migrations. The story of the Green Sahara proves that ancient populations were not always moving or mixing. They could remain biologically distinct for millennia, while their cultural innovations traveled across the globe, leaving traces in our modern DNA, our artifacts, and the very ways we speak. For decades, scientists tried to reverse engineer human history. By analyzing the genetic differences between people alive today, they attempted to trace lineages backward, hoping to map how our ancestors first spread across the globe. The operating assumption was that human expansion was a tidy process. The models of that era suggested that as early humans left Africa, they fanned out in distinct, isolated branches, replacing older groups without significant blending. But reconstructing the deep past using modern DNA is like finding ancient footpaths on a modern highway map. Over millennia, humans have moved and mixed so frequently that recent migrations have essentially overwritten older genetic patterns. The original signals are often blurred or erased. Relying exclusively on people living today created a false impression. It made human populations appear far more isolated and pure in their evolution than they actually were. This blind spot began to clear around 2010. As sequencing costs plummeted, researchers gained the ability to extract high-quality genomes directly from ancient bones. This technology bypassed the genetic clutter of the modern world. Instead of looking at the end result of history, scientists could examine direct snapshots of populations from different points in time. We've gone from sequencing a single ancient genome a decade ago to analyzing thousands of individuals today. This scale allows us to see populations in the exact act of migrating and mingling across continents. By providing a direct look at the past, ancient DNA reveals a history defined not by isolation, but by layers of constant recurring mixture. These mixtures reach back 50,000 years to the first modern human expansion out of Africa. At the time, researchers believed our ancestors simply replaced older species like the Neanderthals. But when the first ancient Neanderthal genome was sequenced and compared to people today, the data showed a statistically significant excess of shared genetic variations. Modern humans and Neanderthals had interbred. 1,000 years ago, Western Eurasia was divided among 4 distinct populations of farmers and hunter-gatherers, groups as genetically different from each other as major continental populations are today. 5,000 years ago, a group known as the Yamnaya disrupted this landscape. They were mobile pastoralists from the steppes who combined the horse with the wheeled wagon. The Yamnaya triggered a massive migration, sweeping westward. Genetic data shows a physical movement of people rapidly overrunning existing groups, rather than a slow adoption of culture. The data from Britain is the most striking. Within centuries of the steppe migration, 90% of the ancestry of the people who built these monuments was replaced by the incoming groups. This turnover aligns with the rapid spread of the Bell Beaker culture across the continent. Ancient DNA confirms this wasn't just a change in pottery styles, it was the arrival of new people carrying the technology with them. In Iberia, the interaction was even more unequal. While the overall ancestry was a 40-60 mix, there was a complete replacement of the local male Y chromosome, suggesting the incoming males had preferential access to reproduction. The genetic similarity seen across Europe today is the physical result of this total population upheaval. A parallel history unfolded in South Asia. Modern populations are often divided by caste and language. Ancient DNA reveals that these demographics are built on similar layers of genetic blending. Most people in the region today are a mixture of three ancient sources: Iranian-related farmers, indigenous hunter-gatherers, and the same steppe pastoralists who moved into Europe. Genomes from ancient regional civilizations capture the early blending between local hunter-gatherers and farmers. This was followed centuries later by the arrival of the steppe pastoralists, who added their genetics to an already mixed population. South Asia's identity, like Europe's, was built through repeated, massive waves of continental blending. Because of the way biology reshuffles DNA every generation, no person carries a single, unadulterated lineage. Sequencing a single ancient individual provides a genetic glimpse of thousands of ancestors stretching into deep time. We are a network of those combined histories. This evidence leads to a clear biological reality. A pure, unmixed human population does not exist in the archaeological record. Mountains, oceans, and modern borders have never stopped the constant churn and collision of groups. Our modern differences are not permanent divisions. They are the most recent snapshot of a species defined by its ability to mix together.